Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Abby Vollmer, Director of Platform Policy and Counsel at GitHub. We're here today to talk about the value of open source software featuring one of our popular projects, YouTube DL, which has 83,000 stars. As you may be aware, the GitHub Trust and Safety team recently reinstated the project after a Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, takedown request. Developers build and ship software in a complex environment governed by laws and regulations. GitHub works hard to support open source and to fight for developers, so this reality really hit home recently with YouTube DL, and we're glad we were able to reinstate the project. Today we'll be hearing from both maintainers and users about the project's beneficial uses and navigating the takedown with GitHub. Let's start by turning over to our speakers to quickly introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Sergey.
Thanks, Abby, and hello, everyone. My name is Sergey, and I'm a software development engineer, and in particular, core developer and maintainer of YouTube DL since 2016. For YouTube DL, I mostly do coding, code reviews, build releases, and support.
Great. Amine, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, I'm Ramita Amine, a student and a core developer in YouTube DL for the last 5 years. And sometimes I do contribute in other related projects, such as multimedia libraries and players, like VLC and FFmpeg.
Great. And Gabby?
Hi, I'm Gabby. I work as the head of open source research at Human Rights Watch, an international NGO that investigates and reports on human rights abuses around the world. And you may have heard the word open source in my job title. So I just wanted to clear this up, that this relates to another kind of open source, which is open source information that's publicly available, rather than open source software and hardware. However, I use a lot of open source tools in my work.
Great. So first things first, this question is for Sergey and Amine. I think our listeners would love to hear what it's like to maintain a project with so many users across multiple continents. Are there any key challenges, benefits, or advice you'd like to share? Let's start with Sergey.
First of all, I would like to briefly describe what actually YouTube DL is about, for those who may never heard of it. Basically, YouTube DL is for download, is a media downloader with lots of options and wide range of supported sites. Yes, despite its name, it's not only for YouTube, but for the most popular media services like YouTube, Vimeo, and so on. As already mentioned by Abby, YouTube DL started back in 2006 by Ricardo Garcia, admittedly gained popularity quite shortly, and eventually moved its development to GitHub in around 2010. Since then, YouTube DL continued its growth and soon became a global collaboration with lots of contributors all around the globe and a worldwide community of users. Maintaining a project like that is not super hard, actually, but it's a great responsibility with very specific challenges. Most of such challenges came from the nature of YouTube DL itself. More specifically, it's all about a never-ending cat-mouse game between YouTube DL and its supported websites that constantly change, and so that YouTube has to constantly overtake. Simply speaking, once some websites' APIs changes, YouTube DL has to adapt to these changes and actually keep itself working. For example, when something changes at YouTube sites, YouTube DL has to overtake and implement fix for that to restore that functionality that just broke. For the most important sites like YouTube, the speed of such reaction is quite important, so that such breakages have to be fixed very fast. You may probably notice many times when YouTube DL stops working for some reason, simply updating it magically fixes the problem. But there is actually no magic happens here, but rather someone have just written a patch and fixed version was released. Another quite important challenge is an overall project maintenance strategy under the limited manpower conditions. Being quite popular, YouTube DL receives an enormous number of issues and pull requests to deal with. So there is always a compromise for us on what features to fix as soon as possible and what we can delay or even not fix at all. What changes do we merge and not to merge yet, and so on. Reviewing the code is also a little bit harder comparing to regular software projects because besides actually reviewing and checking the code itself, we also have to inspect and check whether the extraction algorithm is correct or if it's possible to do better, and so on. We also deal with answering issues and emails and do basic support all on our own. All of this brings us to another compromise on how to achieve maximum productivity, keeping the quality on decent level and minimize our efforts at the same time. But all these challenges eventually come at solid experience you receive that is basically the main benefit as for developer. For me personally, developing YouTube DL boosted my skills significantly, especially on the early stages of involvement in YouTube DL. It's also a great responsibility. It's also a great opportunity for me to touch a lot of different areas like media delivery, internals of streaming protocols, reverse engineering, and many more. I would have probably never touched at my main job as C++ developer. So basically that's it. And now word to Amine. I'm pretty sure he has a lot to add.
Yeah, that was a really good point about websites constantly evolving their design and APIs, and so for tools that rely on those structures like YouTube DL, needing to keep up with those changes is really important. So I agree, your point about it's not just magic. Obviously, somebody needed to make a patch, and you guys work really hard to do that. Amine, we'd love to hear your perspective as well.
For me, the challenge generally have to do with the time constraints and working with users. First, there is a huge number of requests and contributions, and not enough time to keep up with all of it. Besides having other things to take care of and other projects I'm either working on or interested in. Also, users tend to forget that we're volunteers in the projects, and they expect us to respond to every message, fulfill every request, and review every pull request, and so on. But this is simply not within our capability. Regular requests, if a code works, it does not mean it has to be merged, because it needs to meet certain criteria. Such as adhering to the project's coding convention. On another note, there are certain parts of maintaining the code that I may be either not interested in or not good at. Things like documentation and code reviewing. So naturally, I tend to spend less time working on them. At any rate, there have been many positive aspects to working on the project, and also getting support and help from people all around the world. Since the project was created 14 years ago. So I'd like to thank everyone who helped in any way. For the benefits I got working on YouTube DL, it's mainly that I got to acquire some experience and skills in software developer, as well as maintaining projects.
That's great. And I think the point you made about people forgetting that maintainers are often volunteers really is a common challenge across a lot of projects. And I can imagine for this one in particular, it's so popular. And you both mentioned how much, how many issues, pull requests, and this kind of thing you get. So again, thank you. Thanks everyone who's maintaining this project, and especially you two. Gabby, I'd be interested to know, how does Human Rights Watch use open source tools? And then more specifically, can you tell us how Human Rights Watch uses YouTube DL?
Absolutely. So as you can imagine, we work with a lot of sensitive data in our research into human rights abuses. And not only the data is sensitive, but even the fact that we're doing this research can be extremely sensitive. So that means that we have to be extremely careful about the tools that we use. So for instance, our researchers, I wouldn't recommend that they would use a closed source browser-based metadata viewer, for instance, where we didn't know who created it, what data is being collected, or how that data is being stored. And instead would suggest that they use a locally hosted EXIF metadata viewer. And this is quite similar to how I also view video downloading software. And one of our key sources of data that we rely on are videos posted on social media websites and other websites recorded by witnesses and also perpetrators. And in order to analyze this video, we have to download an offline copy. This is because the content can be removed from platforms without any notice really quickly, because maybe the uploader removes it themselves or the platform would remove it. And also because we need an offline copy in order to analyze it. So I go frame by frame in videos looking for clues, and I need a locally hosted copy to do this. And also a locally hosted copy also is essential for me to apply strategies to reduce the impact of viewing distressing and graphic content, which really only work with an offline copy. So because of this, I use YouTube DL every day in my work. I use it to download content. I use the tool's functionality to download videos in the highest quality available. I use the batch. I download batches of videos. And because of security concerns, there's really no alternative to YouTube DL. And because of this, I've also started to train other researchers how to use it at Human Rights Watch. And they see the real need to learn how to use a tool like this because they've experienced too many times content being removed. And we have around 200 researchers based all over the world. And for many, this is the first time they've ever used a terminal. So it's also a really exciting entry tool to introduce to human rights researchers who are completely unfamiliar with a terminal. And because of this, I can then introduce other terminal-based tools. This is how we use YouTube DL every day in our work. And I just want to echo the thanks for inviting us on this panel and also for all the YouTube DL contributors who make this possible.
That's really fascinating, all of the ways that this tool in particular helps your work. And I think a surprise there was the fact that you're able to use that to teach, the kind of the gateway to the terminal. That's a really cool side benefit for that. So I'm curious to know, I'm sure Sergey and Amine are also aware of some interesting applications of the code. So I'd be curious to know if you could share beyond this one that Gabby just explained about how Human Rights Watch uses the code. Are there other applications that might be interesting to discuss, Sergey?
Well, I think it's secret to no one that YouTube DL is used extensively in various software tools as a backend. It's used for archiving and making backups. It's used for offline watching in high quality on slow connections and many, many other typical applications. But I'd like to mention a couple of my favorite ones. The first one I especially like is using YouTube DL for educational purposes, for research and academic pursuits. As you might probably know, lots of researchers rely on large datasets processing and large media dataset processing in particular. Obtaining such datasets may be quite challenging task. That's why many researchers use YouTube DL as a tool for that, as it allows to automate it easily. There were many researchers that used YouTube DL for that purpose, ranges from detection of pirated video re-uploads on YouTube to some recent and quite relevant researches on COVID-19. There is also another quite interesting application of YouTube DL I would like to share, and I actually learned about it not so long ago. I have got an email on that right after the takedown happened. I may be wrong on some details, but basically there is a special mobile-like device for rehabilitation of visually impaired. Among other features, this device affords gaining access to the information, for example, to listen audiobooks or listen audio of YouTube videos. So that obtaining of an audio URL by this device is powered by YouTube DL in the backend. So it's quite amazing how YouTube can be used in seemingly unexpected places and how it may have a social impact and significance, even in indirect fashion. There are way more beneficial uses of YouTube DL you may even imagine. And Amine will bring some other great examples for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be interested to hear. Amine, those are all really great examples. Amine, are there other ones that you might want to share?
What I found interesting among the application of YouTube DL is its use in some artificial intelligence projects to train models for application, including object recognition.
Also a really interesting application. Great. Well, now we've talked a bit about the project. I think it could be good to shift a bit to the reinstatement. I'd actually be interested to hear from all of you on this one. How did you navigate the takedown? Well, first, let's do Sergey and Amine. How did you navigate the takedown and reversal as maintainers of the project? Sergey.
Well, once I figured out the repository was taken down due to DMCA notice, I've sent an email to all the developers, including the former and inactive one, in order to cooperate and work out some strategy. Nobody of us dealt with DMCA previously, and moreover, most of us are not even under the US jurisdiction. So the most reasonable reaction at that point was to ask for some legal help outside. And that's how we ended up getting in touch with EFF. I'm sorry, but I probably can't tell you much details on our interaction and negotiations due to attorney-client privilege. But we were considering many different solutions, ranging from pursuing the counterclaim to moving development of GitHub to some DMCA-agnostic country. Fortunately, thanks to the collaboration of EFF and GitHub, we were able to stay and to keep our development in well-established and recognizable place. So that such outcome was almost the best case scenario for us.
Great. Amine, is there anything you would like to add?
Yes. After receiving the DMCA takedown, I thought the removal of the code could affect not only other parts of YouTube DL, but other projects as well. So we tried to make every possible effort to ensure that the project would continue. And here I want to mention EFF's help that has been crucial, especially their legal advice. And I would like to thank them. And also thank GitHub for reinstating the project and taking a good direction with their new policy.
Thanks. Yeah, and I also would like to thank EFF for working with us to better understand the code. EFF, if our listeners aren't all aware, is Electronic Frontier Foundation, and provides legal advice to the maintainers here. So, well, I mentioned Gabby. I know you're impacted as well. You mentioned you use this tool every day. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what was the impact you saw following the takedown?
So for us, well, the tool still worked. So I think that for us, the impact was just concern for what this might mean for the tool itself, but also for concern for what it might mean for the way we download material, and also what it might mean for the future for other tools that we rely on. In open source research, we use tools that weren't necessarily built for the purpose of human rights research. And unfortunately, we're super used to them getting sunsetted, going behind paywalls, no longer working anymore. However, if something happened to YouTube DL, I think that would be truly devastating for our work. And the reason that YouTube DL is so irreplaceable is not only that it's free and open source, but also it's reliable. And I think, like Sergey was saying with the cat and mouse game, we just couldn't keep up with the changes that platforms make to the way you can download materials. And the fact that YouTube DL has a dedicated group of contributors that can keep up with these changes, it's something that would be impossible for human rights or civil society organizations or journalists who just wouldn't have the resources or technical capacity to do this. And just to give one example, Mnemonic, an organization whose project Syrian Archive has saved 2 million videos from the Syrian conflict using YouTube DL. And when they went back, they ran a script to check how many of these videos were now no longer on YouTube. And they found that 23% of these videos have been permanently removed, meaning that they've been saved in this archive. And those videos would have been lost permanently that depict war crimes and crimes against humanity. And these would have been lost without a tool like YouTube DL. So it's with this in mind that that led me and colleagues at Human Rights Watch to contact EFF and other companies involved to write something that would show the importance of this tool for human rights research and bring together every other human rights organization we knew that uses this tool, which is pretty much all of them.
That's all really important to understand and actually quite relevant to GitHub's policy work advocating for developers. It's a good lead into my last question, actually, because GitHub does and will continue to take a stand for developers, but no matter what we do to protect developer rights, we do need to work within the boundaries of the law. And in this case, the DMCA rules happen to be under review, so we all have an opportunity to help shape the landscape around anti-circumvention. And with that in mind, given your experience with YouTube DL and DMCA, question for all the panelists. What would your message to policymakers be? Let's start with Gabby.
Yes, thanks for this opportunity. For us, we would say restricting access to YouTube DL for everyone for any purpose is not a proportionate response to the fact that this tool could be used in ways that may violate right. So policymakers need to consider the impact on human rights and other use cases that Sergey and Amine highlighted. So our message to policymakers would be that they need to ensure that copyright laws don't improperly restrict rights and eliminate key sources of evidence to hold rights abusers and war criminals accountable. Copyright considerations shouldn't trump access to justice for human rights atrocities. So that would be our message.
Great. Next, let's hear from Amine.
I think for policymakers, it's better to deal with such cases without facilitating the disruption of projects based on unconfirmed claims. And I'm referring specifically to the DMCA law, where the subject of the dispute, the code in this case, is removed until the matter is settled in court.
That makes sense. And Sergey, what would your message to policymakers be?
I think I'll just summarize. I appreciate a lot GitHub's efforts to stand up for developers, as well as I highly welcome changes made in the review process for claims based on DMCA section 1101. And I really hope changes made already at GitHub sites and potential changes in the law itself in the future will probably make it easier for developers to deal with DMCA. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, these are all really useful perspectives for GitHub to be able to take forward as we fight for developers on policy issues. And I have to say, the law behind this is all quite complicated, but our objective is to put developers first. And whether that's documenting human rights abuses, making the internet more accessible, or even going beyond this particular project, learning to code or doing security research or working on infrastructure that powers the cloud, we're here to make sure developers can continue to engage in global collaboration to maintain and improve projects that make a difference in people's lives. And I think this one was a really interesting one to focus on, where, we talked about how it started in Spain many years ago, and it's, we have people all over the world that are maintaining and using the project and has all these great beneficial uses that we've just discussed. And, it was really a big moment for us to kind of see how the community reacted and navigated the situation. GitHub learned a lot too, and I'm really appreciative that we were able to reinstate the YouTube DL project, but also very grateful to have this conversation with Sergey and Amine, who are maintainers of this incredible project. Also, Gabby, representing one of its really vital uses. And I think, all of the conversation we had here today really was quite insightful. And I hope that, I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else learned a lot too. So really want to thank everyone for this great discussion on the very important topic here. And have a wonderful rest of your day or night, wherever you may be. Thanks so much.